Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to talk about the American dream, and my guest is an expert on this topic. Thom Hartmann is an American radio personality, author, former psychotherapist, businessman, and progressive political commentator whose talk show has been rated in the top 10 shows for over a decade by Talkers Magazine. Thom Hartmann, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Great to be back with you, Bill. Thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you being with me today. You've had a busy day already, so we'll expedite this. But we're going to talk about your new book that's come out about the American dream, the hidden history of the American dream. But could you spend a minute or two and talk about the unique talk show you have, Eastern time zones from noon to 3 on Free Speech TV, YouTube, and hundreds of other stations around the country? What is the purpose of this talk show?
Yeah, it's also on Sirius XM on their Progress channel, which is their progressive channel. It's probably our largest audience. I started the show 21 years ago in response to what I felt was, Limbaugh and all those right wingers were really starting to take hold on radio. And I believed that they're having a background in radio. I was a DJ back when I was a teenager and then did 7 years of radio news. And I believed that there was a market for progressive talk radio. So I wrote an op-ed about it. That became the original business plan for Air America Radio. We started the show, we started the network. The network ultimately died when we were on 54 Clear Channel stations. And when Mitt Romney decided to run for president, he had his company buy Clear Channel. And then they took us off all those stations, and that killed the network. But our show continued. And it's progressive talk radio. It's caught a good audience.
Right.
That's about it.
Exactly. And our viewers can go to your website at www.thomhartmann.com to get a lot more information.
Right, or the new main website for the show is now tom.tv, thom.tv.
Oh, okay. thom.tv. Okay, thank you for the update. All right. And of course, you have this new book out. It's The Hidden History of the American Dream. And this is just part of a best-selling series and includes 9 other books that you have, I guess. And viewers can go to this website, I hope it's right, www.hiddenhistorybooks.com, to see the other books and this one also. But let's dive into it. What is the theme of your new book, The Hidden History of the American Dream?
It's this radical idea that was played with at the nation's founding and then kind of realized in the 1930s and 40s that a strong middle class would be a good thing for democracy and would be a good thing for the people of a country. If you don't regulate capitalism in particular ways, what you end up with unregulated capitalism is the world that Charles Dickens wrote about. In the famous, the story of his that most people are familiar with or have even read or seen the movies or TV shows, the Christmas Carol. You have Scrooge and Marley, these two partners in this business. Marley's dead, who run a small business. They were the middle class. The middle class was the shopkeepers, the lawyers, the doctors, the small business people. In fact, he was such a small businessman that he only had one employee, who was Bob Cratchit. So that middle class made up about 3% of British society at the time Dickens was writing. Then you had the very, very rich, which was about 1% of British society, which were the people who were associated with the royal families and the families who made money from, the shipping empires and whatnot. Great wealth. And then you had 96% of everybody else, which was the poor. In fact, Great Britain for centuries had maximum wage laws. It was against the law for an employer to pay a person more than a certain amount, because there was this belief that if the middle class ever got larger than 3 or 4%, it would cause social instability. Sir Edmund Burke wrote about this at some length, a conservative British economist and philosopher who's widely quoted these days by Republicans. This was during the time of the American and French revolutions. And, the founders of this country pushed back on that and wanted to create a country where everybody could be in the middle class. It was possible. And it largely was the case from, the mid 1600s until the late the late 1700s, really, or the early 1800s, because there was so much free land. We just stole all this land from the Indians, and so all these Europeans had, decent lives. But then throughout the 19th century, throughout the 1800s, people just got poorer and poorer and poorer, to the point where in 1900, the average income of the average family, the bottom 90% of American families, was less than, in today's dollars, $10,000 a year. And people lived in pretty bad poverty. So after the Republican Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt came along, and he had been reading the writings of both Adam Smith, who had argued for a middle class. His famous book is, The Wealth of Nations, but the book where Smith argues for a middle class is called A Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Roosevelt had been reading that, and he'd been reading the writings of John Maynard Keynes, a more modern economist, who was saying essentially the same thing, that a middle class was actually a good thing, that a middle class would stabilize a country, a middle class would strengthen a country. And so FDR set out to create a middle class. And he did this by placing a very high tax on great wealth, 91% income tax, a 70% estate tax, and a 55% or 51% tax on profits made by corporations. Now, those high taxes didn't kick in until you got really rich. You didn't pay any estate tax unless your estate was worth millions. You didn't pay that 91% income tax bracket unless you were making over about $5 million in today's money. Corporations didn't pay that 51% tax until they were making tens of millions of dollars in profits. But what that did was it served as a social stabilizer. And that was the beginning of the American middle class in the 1930s.
And we had a burgeoning middle class in the 50s, 60s, and a lot of that had to do, as I've read, and I think you'll agree with this, with the unionization of so many industries, strong unions. Now we see union busting taking place. We see the race to the bottom. We see this globalization in some sectors where you have to work for a cheaper hourly rate just to compete with the Vietnamese and the Chinese. How have all of these factors, plus much more or many more, contributed to the sort of the demise of the American dream, or maybe even putting it on life support?
No, you're absolutely right, Bill. And legalizing unions with the Wagner Act in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, was probably one of the most significant things that FDR did that created the middle class. And so by 1980, when Ronald Reagan came into office, fully a third of Americans had union jobs, and because union jobs tended to set the local wage floor, meant that 2/3 of Americans had the equivalent in terms of salary and benefits of a good union job. And thus we had over 60% of us in the middle class, where with a single income, you could support a family, you could take a vacation every year, you could save enough for retirement, you could put your kids through school, and you could buy a new home. That was kind of the high point, 1980. But the Reagan story kind of has a little backstory to it. In 1951, a guy named Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind. And in that book, and at that point, the middle class was just passing the 50% threshold. It was growing, but it hadn't yet gotten as big as it was when Reagan came in. And in that book, he argued that if the middle class ever got too large, specifically over 50%, that it would create social chaos. He was making the argument that Edmund Burke had made. In fact, the subtitle of his book is From Burke to Eliot, from Edmund Burke to T.S. Eliot. And he said that what would happen was women would forget their place in society. Young people would stop respecting their elders, and minorities would start demanding rights that they didn't have the intellectual capacity to properly exercise. And I mean, very racist argument. But this was largely ridiculed in the 50s by Republicans and conservatives, even though he was one of the leading conservative thinkers. They thought, you're a crackpot. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater both loved Kirk, but they were the exceptions. And then came the 60s. In 1961, the birth control was legalized. Birth control pill was legalized, or approved by the FDA. In 1964, 65, we had the Vietnam War going on. And throughout the 60s, you had Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And so by 66, 67, you had cities in flames from civil rights riots, essentially. You had women, quote, burning their bras. You had this active, very active women's movement and demanding rights in the workplace. And you had young people saying, I'm not going to go to war, burning their draft cards. which was exactly what Kirk had predicted. And so all these Republicans are going, oh my God, look at this. Kirk was a prophet. This middle class has gotten too large and it's going to destroy America. So what's the solution? Take the middle class down a peg. And that was Reagan's imperative. That was his job that he was elected to do. And he did. Right now the middle class is 43% of us. It used to be 65% of us. And even at that, it takes two salaries now to be in the middle class rather than one. So, and Reagan did this by union busting, destroying the unions. He went after Patco by cutting that top tax rate down to 27%, by doing essentially away with the estate tax, drilling it full of loopholes, doing away with the corporate tax. I mean, nowadays, your average billionaire pays around 8% income tax, whereas your average bus driver is paying 25%. So, the middle class has been under assault continuously now for 44 years.
It certainly has. And Tom, we're going to come back in just a moment after the mid-show ID. And if you could give us 5 specifics that we could adopt to help reverse this demise of the American dream. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our show and you would like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with Thom Hartmann, who's written a very interesting book on the American dream, the hidden history of the American dream. Tom, there's so many things we could talk about, but what are 5 or 6 things that you would recommend in the last 10 minutes that we have that should be done differently to sort of reactivate this belief in the American dream and to make it possible for people? Because it's certainly fleeting when you see this vast chasm of inequality in this country. You see Congress, which is dependent upon dark money in some cases, and donations from corporations like the fossil fuels industry, a variety of things like that. What are 5 things that need to be done as soon as possible to overcome this problem, or at least ameliorate it?
It's a great question, Bill, and it's not a mystery because we've done this before. We did this in the era from 1933 until 1981. And so it's pretty straightforward. Number one, we need to encourage greater unionization. And that means knocking down or reversing a series of Supreme Court decisions that made it harder to unionize, strengthening the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, and basically ending union busting. People should have a right to unionize, number one. Number two, we need to raise the top income tax bracket. And the reason for that, pretty straightforward. Used to be if you made more than $3, $4, $5 million a year, suddenly you were paying 74% income tax. That was the rate when Reagan came into office. And because of that, the average CEO in the United States in 1980 or in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, the average CEO only took home 30 times what his or her lowest paid employee made. That worked to the benefit of the businesses because they kept the money in the business. It worked to the benefit of society. I mean, you go back and look at some of the TV shows from the 60s, like the Dick Van Dyke Show. Here he is, a writer for a television program. These people today make millions of dollars. Back then, he's living in this suburban home. You look at Bewitched, yeah, right. Her husband was the vice president of a Madison Avenue ad agency, but they lived in a normal middle-class home. Elizabeth Montgomery's husband, Dick York in that show. That was America back then. CEOs actually lived in the same neighborhood. They might have had the nicest house in the neighborhood, but they didn't have 6 mansions around the world and 700-foot mega yachts, and they weren't shooting themselves into outer space on penis-shaped rockets. So that top income tax bracket tended to stabilize. And we only had 8 billionaires in America when Reagan came into office. Now we have over 800. And so that tended to stabilize the wealth inequality and kept a lot of that money in the middle class. There's been a $51 trillion transfer of wealth from middle class families, homes, and pensions into the money bins of the top 1% in the 44 years since Reagan changed the tax laws. So that's number two, is raise the top corporate income or top income tax. Number three would be raise the top corporate income tax. And the reason for that is tax deductions. I've run a bunch of businesses in my life, and the one thing I know is that if I don't want to pay income taxes on my company's profits at the end of the year, I invest in my company. If you develop a new product, if you do R&D, if you buy new equipment, if you expand your product line, if you open a new factory or a new outlet or a new store, if you hire new people, if you pay them better, all of those things are tax deductible. All of them will reduce the profit on which you pay income taxes. So a well-run company could pay very little tax by simply growing. And that's why we had this phenomenal growth of business from the 1930s until the 1980s. We beat every country in the world in terms of the speed with which and the solidity with which we were building businesses in America. So raising that corporate top income tax bracket actually incentivizes corporations to do the right thing, to build their business, rather than the wrong thing, which is just to shovel all that money into the pockets of their CEOs and stockholders. That's number two, or number three, I guess. Number four would be reestablish the inheritance tax. This was Teddy Roosevelt's big thing in the early, the first decade of the 1900s of the 20th century. And again, the goal here is not to prevent absolute dynastic wealth. I mean, even with the 70% top estate tax bracket that we had back then, you still had, the Rockefellers still did just fine, thank you very much. But these massive, right now, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are worth more than literally any king in history, any pharaoh, any emperor. We've never seen this kind of wealth before. And it gets passed down through generations. It becomes, frankly, toxic, both to the people within the families and to the society. So we need to reestablish the estate tax. I think there's a number of other things that, for example, the Harris campaign is suggesting a $50,000 tax break for people who want to start new businesses, start small businesses. That's one of a whole package of incentives for small businesses that would be a really good thing to bring back the American dream. So, and then finally, I would say, the social safety net. When I was running businesses in the 70s in Michigan, I had an herbal tea company and an ad agency, and we had 18 employees, and everybody had health insurance. And my recollection is it cost me $35 a month per person. And the reason it was so cheap was because in Michigan at that time, all hospitals had to be nonprofits, and all health insurance companies had to be nonprofits. And so, we had 3 hospitals in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan. They were all nonprofits. They're all for-profit now, by the way. And we got our insurance from Blue Cross Blue Shield, which was a nonprofit. It kept costs down. Now, because Reagan changed all that stuff in the 80s, and at the state level, it got changed as well. Now you've got like Dollar Bill McGuire, the guy who ran United Healthcare for years, walked away with $1.6 billion. And every penny of that, or at least many of the pennies of that, were made by saying, no, I'm not going to pay for your child's liver transplant. And that's no way to run what should be a human right, a basic infrastructure. So we need to fix the healthcare situation, and we need to fix our education system. When Reagan came into office, you could go to college pretty much anywhere in America. I put myself through college. I didn't graduate, but I put myself through college working at Bob's Big Boy as a dishwasher. You could do that. You can't do that now, because when Reagan came into office, 80% of tuition was covered by state and federal monies and endowments, and 20% was tuition. Now, 80% of the cost of college is tuition, and only 20% is covered. This was Reagan's big plan, because he thought that students were out of control, and the way to get them back under control was to make them in debt. So we've got a $2 trillion student debt problem, and young people aren't starting families. They're not starting businesses. They're paralyzed. I think that's a summary. I mean, there's a few other things in the book, but those are I think the most important things to put back together. And by the way, those are the things that work in other countries.
Yes, they do. And they're very important. And as you mentioned, there are many other things we could do, like raise the minimum wage, get some of this money from the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, so many other things. But let me ask you, we've only got about a minute left, but we are deluded, I think, by believing we're in really a free market capitalist system. Free market. This is not a free market system with monopolists who control a large part of our society, the industries and what have you. And should we rethink this? And maybe the business schools should take a different approach and start training these business people to think this is not exactly the ideal situation with these oligopolists and folks like that running the situation, raising prices arbitrarily. What do you think? Yes or no on that?
Absolutely agree with you, Bill. Competition should be the primary directive of capitalism. And you can't have competition when you have monopolies. That's why we had the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1891. We've had two other additions to it, the Clayton Act and the 1954 Act. We need to be enforcing those laws.
Exactly. Well, Thom Hartmann, your book is so interesting, and there's so many other parts of it we didn't have a chance to touch on today, but we'll have to get you back later on and we'll pick up the parts that we left behind. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. It's always a pleasure and an honor to hang out here with you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.